I am Cassandra and welcome back to the Oxford Weaving Studio YouTube channel. Today we're talking about Rya Knots and Rya Loops. Now this is a new weaving techniques video in our series of weaving techniques, and you're going to learn how to put your Rya Knots or Rya Loops in different ways on different shapes and forms. And the reason I'm showing them together is because they are very similar techniques and you can kind of interchange them. So let's get started. Hi, so thank you for joining me. I've got the table set up here with two different projects. We're going to finish off some of the Rya loops on this circular art piece so I can show you what it looks like to do a continuous piece of continuous series of Rya loops. And I'm going to set up my little mini frame loom here and show you Rya knots as well. And it will depend on how many Rya knots you want to make or how many Rya loops. So if you want a whole bunch or just a few, the technique will depend on that. So I'm going to just put these aside for the moment. We're going to work on that in a short while. So we're going to set up a quick warp on this little loom that I've got here, and I think I'm going to use this one here. So if you see here, I've got a little what I call a tapestry bundle. If you haven't yet checked out my video on how to create these little tapestry bundles, you should go and do that because it's really handy for small scraps of yarn to keep them from tangling. So now that we've set up a warp, I'm going to show you how to do fringe like we have in this example here. Now this actually has 2 rows of fringe. You might not be able to make that out because there's 2 different colors. So we've got some hand spun yarn here. So if I lift these up, you can just make out that there's actually 2 rows of them sitting on top of a cotton fringe as well. So I've got 2 layers of fringe. I'll show you how to do that because that when you do 2 rows, you can actually offset them and they sit slightly differently. So I'm just going to start with a few rows of plain weave. Now, if you haven't done very much weaving before, whenever you're working with Rya knots or Rya loops, you almost always have to secure them with plain weave or a very stable technique in between, because if you don't, they fall apart. So if I just get a couple of rows of plain weave set up, and then we'll start the Rya loops, Rya knots. Now that we have our 4 rows of plain weave, I'm going to take the amount that I want for the fringe, and I think I'm actually going to use this cotton, this blue cotton. So the way that you measure out the length of your Rya knots, it really will depend on how big your piece, how long your piece is, if you want to cut or trim your piece later on an angle or a diagonal, something like that. So that will depend on how long you cut it, but I'm going to do a straight fringe right across. And I know from working on this size of loom quite often that basically if I measure something that is almost 1 times the width of my frame loom, and then I double that up, I will get the size that I want, and then I'll have room to cut. So if I do want to do a little bit of trimming afterwards, I'll have plenty to choose from. So first thing you do is you cut your one that you want to measure all the others against, and then for Rya knots you always work in pairs. Now that is a rule, but there are of course exceptions to that rule, but today we're going to show you quickly over 2. So if you have, I've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 warp threads. 10 divided by 2 is 5. I need to cut 5 of these ends. Now, if you're cutting loads and loads and loads of them, the way I suggest is kind of like this, where you quickly measure out your length, or you measure your length somewhere on a table, and then you quickly count 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you measure and cut then. But if you're doing loads and loads and loads, I tend to do like this, and I keep going. So I think I've got 5 or maybe even 6. That's okay. So how many did I actually cut? I cut 6. Perfect. That's fine. So I have one extra than what I need. So now what we want to do for Rya knots, quite simple. You are going to be using both sides, both strands. This is the middle where I'm holding with my thumb. You want to lay it across the 2 warp ends that you're working on. You want to lift them up with your finger. I'm left-handed, but sometimes I work with my right hand, so you find your most comfortable way of working as well. And what you do is you lay it across the two that you've got. You take the left-hand side of your measured string, wrap it around the left side and up through the middle. If I do that again, I'll hold it with my other finger just to make that easy. You have the right side of your string here. You're wrapping it around the right hand warp thread of the pair. Again, around from the back up through the middle. Before you tighten, you want to measure the ends. You're going to tug up. This will make it so that you have even length for both of the warp threads, of your Rya knot. And then you slide it down so that it sits on top of your plain weave. So you see here, it's essentially wrapping around two of your warp ends. I'll show you that again. You grab your next one, holding it as if in the middle. You want to measure them out. You take your string, you lay it across. That middle is somewhere on the next two warp threads. I now pick it up with my finger and wrap. I can hold it here as well. I can wrap the left one around the left-hand side of your warp thread. It goes around the back and up through the middle, switching hands and holding again. You're taking the right one, wrapping around and under and up through the middle of the right warp thread and pulling it down again. And so now you have 2 rows of Rya knots, and we'll do the same again. Now I'm going quicker. I'm picking one up with my left, one with my right, matching the pair and pulling down, and same again. Over the left, over the right, matching them up. And the reason I match them up, so if you're working with, if you're using offcuts, sometimes you'll find that if you've got different lengths, you want to make sure that you measure them out so that you don't have to cut to the lowest one. So if I take this last one and show you, if I didn't do that, if I just randomly wrapped it around, let's see how that's going to go. Can you see here that there's one longer than the other? If you do that, then if you want a straight fringe, you're going to have to cut up to the lowest one, which means you waste all that length. So try and get in the habit, if you are trying to get them even, at least to start, match them up before you pull your knot down. There you can see that you've got your first row. Now, the other thing that you can probably spot is that it's very sparse. There's actually quite a lot of opening here. So what you can do is you can actually add in another row of knots, or millions if you like. But instead of going and placing them exactly on the first 2 that you've just started with, you can actually forget the first one and the last one and just work on the next 2 pairs of warp threads. And that will essentially fill this gap that you've created with the first row. So if the yarn that you're using, like mine, leaves that space, for example, if you use a super chunky yarn, you might not get that because it's a fuller, chunkier yarn, and it tends to cover up the warp threads quite cleverly. So if you have this problem, I'm going to go and take another row of my yarn, and hopefully I have enough to create 4. So I'll just go and cut another. So the first time I had 5, we're eliminating 1 row, so we essentially need 4 for this next one. And this should give us 4. So again, skipping the first one, picking up the next 2 next 2 pairs of warp threads, wrapping around the left-hand side and going up through the middle. And on the right-hand side, taking the right one around the right and up the middle, matching them up, and then pulling them down and tucking them. And now you can already see they start to fill in the gap and create a fuller fringe. Now, how tight you pull them, that's really up to you. And it depends on the type of yarn and the effect you're trying to create. So I'm kind of leaving mine a little bit open so that my warp threads still remain quite openly spaced. And you are then just adding the fringe in as it needs to. So I'm going to leave that fringe. So that's essentially how you create Rya knots if you're working on a small project, or you're using waste yarns, or you just have a few of them to do. Now, if you wanted to do several of them, now it works slightly differently. Can you notice, of course, that we were just working on pairs of warp threads? Now, it is possible to do Rya knots with a continuous piece of long warp thread. However, that essentially becomes a Rya loop when it's a continuous piece, because what you do is you create your Rya loops on a continuous sequence, and then you cut them afterwards to create the fringe. So essentially, if you wanted to do lots and lots and lots of fringe or Rya knots, then you start with what we call Rya loops. So I'll show you that now, except that I just want to point out here, after I've woven my Rya knots, they're not a secure technique. If they're moved, or if these are on a cushion, or if they're being handled in any way, they're not stable, they're not secure. So what you need to do is secure them with rows of plain weave. Now that can be one row, it can be several, depends on your design, but the minimum you do is one, and I would always recommend two, just in case the pattern that you're creating is slightly different. So I'm going to go and continue with the weft thread that I had set up before, and I'm going to make sure that it tucks in behind that first Rya knot so you don't see it. There was an argument here for you to cut that first bit of 4 rows. So if you just to remind you, I've got my 4 rows underneath here, and it finished on the left hand side. You could cut that and tuck it in at the end, because sometimes you don't want to see the continuation of this row as it comes after the Rya knots. But in that event, then you can cut it. If not, you just continue like I have and hide it underneath, but you have the option to cut it first. So there's my 2 rows. Now everything is secure. Now it's not going to move, and it won't unravel. But like I said, if you're making a cushion or something that will be used or worn, or a scarf, I would definitely secure it with more than just 2 on the bottom and top, so that they don't come loose. So there you have Rya knots. So I hope this helps you. There are different ways of doing it. So you start off with cutting your Rya knots and measuring them out if you're just doing a small amount, or you want a flat facing Rya knot. You can create Rya knots by creating first the Rya loops. And again, the Rya loops, it's different ways to do it so that it uses 1 individual work thread. You could actually use 2 if you wanted, but I've just done 1 so that the spacing remains consistent, and it gives you a much fuller fringe, or fuller loops. And then to create the actual Rya knots, if you've created loops first, is simply just to go and cut them and trim them later on. So that's the way to weave lots of them on a continuous thread, and if you're wanting to weave them quicker. So thanks very much for joining me for this tutorial. I hope it's been helpful. If you have any questions or comments, please pop those in the box down below. And if you'd like to follow me on Instagram, you can, and follow me at Oxford Weaving Studio. Same on Facebook. And of course, I'd love for you to subscribe to my channel as I get more videos uploaded and keep going. Now that we're out of lockdown, I'm hoping I can be in the studio more regularly and keep filming videos. So if you like the video, please like it and subscribe to the channel. Thanks again. See you next time.